Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
The Coming of the White Worm by Clark Ashton Smith. Chapter 9 of the Book of Ebon. Ava the Warlock, dwelling beside the Boreal Sea, was aware of many strange and untimely portents in midsummer. Chilly burned the sun above Mutalan from a heaven clear and pallid as ice. At eve, the aura was hung from the zenith to earth, like an arras in a high chamber of gods. Wan and rare were the poppies, and the small anemones in the cliff-hidden vales behind Yvon's house, and the fruits in his walled garden were pale and rind and green at the core. He saw by day the unseasonable flight of great multitudes of fowl going southward from the isles beyond Tulan, and by night he heard the clamor of other passing multitudes. Now Yvon was troubled by these portents, for his magic could not wholly interpret them, and the rude fisher-folk on the shore of the haven below his house were also troubled in their fashion. Day by day they had gone forth through the summer in their corals of elkite and willow, casting their scenes, but in the scenes they drew only dead fish, blasted as if by fire or extreme cold. And because of this, as the summer drew on, it came to pass that few of them fared any longer to sea. Then, out of the north, were ships from Cerngoth, were wont to ply among the Arctic islands. A galley came drifting with idle oars and aimlessly veering helm, and the tide bleached it among the fishermen's boats on the sands beneath the cliff-built house of Yvon. And thronging about the galley, the fishers beheld its oarsmen still at the oars, and its captain at the helm. But the faces and hands of all were white as leprosy, and the pupils of their open eyes had faded strangely, being indistinguishable from the whites, and the blankness of horror was within them like ice in deep pools fast frozen to the bottom. Loath were the fishers to touch the dead man, and they murmured, saying that a doom was upon the sea, and a curse upon all seafaring things and people. But Yvon deemed that the bodies would rot in the sun and would breed pestilence, commanded them to build a pile of driftwood about the galley, and when the pile had risen above the bulwarks, hiding from view the dead rowers, he fired it with his own hands. High flamed the pale, and smoke ascended black as a storm cloud, blowing its windy volumes. But when the fire sank, the bodies of the oarsmen were still sitting amidst the mounted embers, and their arms were still outstretched in the posture of rowing, and their fingers were clenched, though the oars had now dropped away from them in brands and ashes, and the galley's captain stood upright still in his place, though the burnt helm had fallen beside him. Naught but the raiments of the corpses had been consumed, and they shone white as marble above the charrings of wood, and nowhere upon them was any blackness left by the fire. Deeming this thing an ill prodigy, the fishers were all aghast, and they fled swiftly to the highmost rocks. But the sorcerer Yvon waited the cooling of the brands. Quickly the brands darkened, but smoke arose from them still throughout the noon and afternoon, and still they were over hot for human dreading when the hour drew near towards sunset. So Yvon fetched water in the urns from the sea and cast it upon the ashes and charrings, so that he might approach the corpses. After the smoke and hissing had died, he went forward. Nearing the bodies, he was aware of a great coldness, and the coldness began to ache in his hands and ears, and smote sharply through his mantle of fur. Going still closer, he touched one of the bodies with his forefinger tip, and the finger, though lightly pressed and quickly withdrawn, was seared as if by flame. Yvon was much amazed, for the condition of the corpse was a thing unknown to him heretofore, and in all his science of wizardry there was naught to enlighten him. Returning to his house ere night, he burned at each door and window the gums that are most offensive to the northern demons. Afterwards he pursued with sedulous care the writings of Nam, in which are collated many powerful exorcisms against the white spirits of the pole. For these spirits, it seems, had laid their power upon the galley's crew, and he could not but apprehend some further working of the power. Though a fire burned in the chamber, piled with fat pine and terebinth, a deadly chill began to invade the air towards midnight, and Yvon's fingers grew numb on the sheets of parchment, so that he could scarcely turn them, and the cold deepened steadily, slowing his blood as if with ice, and he felt on his face the breathing of an icy wind. Yet the heavy doors and the stout-paned windows were tightly closed, and the fire blazed high, in no need of replenishment. Then, with eyes whose very lids had stiffened about them, Yvon saw that the room grew brighter with a light shining through the northern window. Pale was the light, and it entered the room in a great beam falling directly upon him where he sat, and the light seared his eyes with a chill radiance, and the cold sharpened as if somehow one with the brightness. And the wind blew swifter out of the light, seeming no longer air, but an element rare and unbreathable as ether. Vainly, with numbing thoughts, he strove to recall the exorcism of Nam, and his breath forsook him on the thin wind, and he fell down in a sort of waking swoon that was nigh to death. He seemed to hear voices muttering unfamiliar spells, while the bleak light and ether ebbed and flowed like a tide about him. And in time it seemed that his eyes and his flesh were tempered to endure them, and he breathed once more, and his blood quickened again in his veins, and the swoon passed, and he rose up like one that rises from the dead, full upon him pouring the strange light through the window. But the stiffness of cold was gone from his limbs, and he felt no more the chilliness that was natural to the late summer night. Looking forth from one of the windows, he witnessed a strange marvel. For the harbor there towered an iceberg such as no vessel had yet sighted in the seafaring to the north. It filled the broad haven from shore to shore, and sheered up to a height immeasurable, with piled escarpments and tiered precipices, and its pinnacles hung like towers in the zenith. It was vaster and steeper than the mountain Yarek, which marks the site of the boreal pole, and from it there fell upon the sea and land a frosty, glittering paler and brighter than the light of the full moon. On the shore below were the charrings of the beached galley, and among them the corpses incombustible by fire. And along the sands and rocks the fisher-folk were lying or standing upright in still, rigid postures, as if they had come forth to behold the great iceberg that had been smitten by a magic spell, and the whole harbor shore and the garden of Yvonne, filled with that pallid splendor, was like a place where frost had fallen thickly over all. Feeling a great wonder, Yvonne would have gone forth from his high house, but ere he had taken 3 steps, a numbness came upon all his members, and deep sleep overpowered his senses even where he stood. The sun had risen when he awoke. Peering out, he beheld a new marvel, for his garden and the rocks and sea sands below were visible no more. In their stead were level space of ice about his house, and tall ice pinnacles. Beyond the verges of ice he saw a sea that lay remotely and far beneath, and beyond the sea the low looming of a dim shore. Terror came to Yvonne now, for he recognized in all of this the workings of a sorcery beyond the power of mortal wizards. Plain it was that his stout house of granite stood no longer on the coast of Moutsalé, but was based now on some upper crag of that stupendous iceberg he had beheld the night. Trembling, he prayed and knelt to the old ones who secretly dwelt in subterranean caves, or abided under the sea, or in the supermundane spaces. And even as he prayed, he heard a loud knocking at his door. Fearfully, he arose and opened the portal. Before him were 2 men, strange of visage and bright-skinned, who wore the mantles, such rune-enwoven stuffs as wizards wear. The runes were uncouth and alien, but when the men bespoke him, he understood something of their speech, which was in a dialect of the Hyperborean Isles. "We serve the Outer One, whose name is Relim Skykoreth," they said. "From spaces beyond the north he has come in his floating citadel, the ice mountain Yikith, from which pours an exceeding coldness and a pale splendor that blasts the flesh of men. He has spared us alone amid the inhabitants of the Isle of Thulask, tempering our flesh to the rigor of his abode, making respirable for us the air no mortal man may breathe, and taking us to go with him in his seafaring upon Yikith. Thee also has he spared and acclimated by his spells to the coldness and thin ether. Hail, O Yvonne, whom we know for a great wizard by this token, since only the mightiest of warlocks are thus chosen and exempted." Sorely astonished was Yvonne, but seeing that he had now to deal with men who were as himself, he questioned closely the 2 magicians of Thulask. They were named Duni and Uxludan, and were wise in the lore of the elder gods. They would tell him nothing of Relim Shykorth, but avowed that their service to this being consisted of such worship as was given to a god, together with the repudiation of all bonds that had linked them heretofore to mankind. And they told Yvonne that he was to go with them at once before Relim Shykorth, and perform the due rites of obedience, and accept the bond of alienage. So Yvonne went with the Thulaskians, and was led by them to the great pinnacle of ice that rose unmeltable into the sun, beetling above its fellows. The pinnacle was hollow, and climbed therein by stairs of ice. They came at last to the chamber of Relim Shykorth, which was a circular dome with a round block at the center forming a dais. At sight of that entity which occupied the dais, Yvonne's pulse was stilled for an instant by terror, and followed upon the terror, his gorge rose within him through excess of loathing. In all the world there was nothing that could be likened for its foulness to Rim Shikorth. Something he had of the semblance of a fat white worm, but his bulk was beyond that of the sea elephant. His half-coiled tail was thick as the middle folds of his body, and his front reared upward from the dais in the form of a white round disk, and upon it were imprinted vague lineaments. Amidst the visage, a mouth curved uncleanly from side to side of the disk, opening and shutting incessantly on a pale and tongueless and toothless maw. 2 eye sockets lay close together above the shallow nostrils, but the sockets were eyeless, and in them appeared from moment to moment globules of blood-colored matter, having the form of eyeballs, and even the globules broke and dripped down before the dais. And from the ice floor there ascended 2 masses like stalagmites, purple and dark as frozen gore, which had been made by this ceaseless dripping of the globules. Dooney and Uxludon prostrated themselves, and Yvonne deemed it well to follow their example. Lying prone on the ice, he heard the red drops falling with a splash of heavy tears. And then, in the dome above him, it seemed that a voice spoke, and the voice was like the sound of some hidden cataract in a glacier hollow with caverns. "Oh, Yvonne," said the voice, "I have preserved thee from the doom of others, and have made thee as they that inhabit the bourne of coldness, and inhale the airless void. Wisdom ineffable shall be thine. Wisdom ineffable shall be thine, and mastery beyond the conquest of mortals, if thou wilt but worship me and become my thrall. With me thou shalt voyage amidst the kingdoms of isles and earth, and see the white falling of death upon them in the light from Yikith. Our coming shall bring eternal frost on their gardens, and shall set upon their people's flesh the rigors of trans-Arctic gulfs. All this shalt thou witness, being as one of the lords of death, supernal and immortal, and in the end thou shalt return with me to that world beyond the pole, in which is mine abiding empire." Seeing that he is without choice in the matter, Yvonne professed himself willing to yield worship and service to the pale worm. Instructed by his fellow wizards, he performed the rites that are scarce suitable for narration, and swore the vow of unspeakable alienage. Strange was that voyage, for it seemed that the great iceberg was guided by sorcery, prevailing ever against wind and tide, and always as they went, the chill splendor smote afar from Yikith. Proud galleys were overtaken, and their crews were blasted at the oars. The fair Hyperborean ports, busy with maritime traffic, were stilled by the iceberg's passing. Idle were the streets and wharfs, Idle was the shipping in their harbors, where the pale light had come and gone. Far inland fell the rays, bringing to the fields and gardens a blight more lasting than that of winter. And forests were frozen, and the beasts that roamed them were turned as if into marble, so that men who came long after to that region found the elk and bear and mammoth still standing in all the postures of life. But sitting in his house, or walking abroad on the burg, Yvonne was aware of no sharper cold than that which abides in summer shadows. Now, besides Dooney and Ex-Loudon, there were 5 other wizards that went with Yvonne on that voyage, having been chosen by Relim Shikorth and transported with their houses to the burg through unknown enchantment. They were outlandish men, called Polarians, from islands nearer the pole than broad Thulask. Evan could understand little of their ways, and their sorcery was foreign, and their speech unintelligible to him, nor was it known to the Thulaskans. Daily the 8 wizards found on their tables all provender necessary for human sustenance, though they knew not the agency that supplied it. All were united in the worship of the worm, but Yvonne was uneasy at heart, beholding the doom that went forth eternally from Yakith upon lovely cities and fruitful ocean shores. Ruthful he saw the blasting of flower-girdled Surgoth, and the stillness that descended on the thronged streets of Dequain, and the frost that seared with sudden whiteness the garths and orchards of the sea-fronting valley of Aguel. Ever southward sailed the great berg, bearing its lethal winter to lands where summer's sun rode high. And Evan kept his own counsel, and followed in all ways the custom of the others. At intervals there was regulated by the motion of the circumpolar stars. The warlocks climbed to that lofty chamber in which Relim Shikorth abode perpetually, half coiled on his dais of ice. There, in a ritual whose cadences corresponded to the falling of those eye-like tears that were wept by the worm, and with genuflections timed to the yawning and shutting of its mouth, they yielded to Relim Shikorth the required adoration, and Yvonne learned from the others that the worm slept for a period at each darkening of the moon, and only at that time did the sanguine tears suspend their falling, and the mouth forbear its alternate closing and gaping. At the 3rd repetition of the rites, it came to pass that only 7 wizards climbed to the tower, Yvonne, counting their number, perceiving that the missing man was one of the 5 outlanders. Later he questioned Dooney and Ex-Loudon, and made signs of inquiry to the 4 Northernons, but it seemed that the fate of the absent warlock was a thing mysterious to all. Nothing was seen or heard from him, and Yvonne pondered long and deeply, and was somewhat disquieted, for during the ceremony in the tower chamber it seemed to him that the worm was grosser in bulk and girth than on any former occasion. Covertly he asked the Thulaskians what manner of nutriments was required by Relim Shikorth. Concerning this there was some dispute, for Uxlandan maintained that the worm fed on the hearts of white Arctic bears, while Dooney swore that his rightful nourishment was the liver of whales. But to their knowledge, the worm had not eaten during their sojourn upon Yakith. Still the iceberg followed its course beneath the heightening sun, And again, as the star-appointed time, which the forenoon of every third day, the sorcerers convened in the worm's presence. Their number was now but 6, and the lost warlock was another of the outlanders. And the worm had greatened still more in size, thickening visibly from head to tail. Now in their various tongues, the 6 remaining wizards implored the worm to tell them the fate of their absent fellows. And the worm answered, and his speech was unintelligible to all, each thinking he had been addressed in his own language. "This matter is a mystery, but ye all shall receive enlightenment in turn. Know this, the 2 that have vanished are still present, and they and ye shall share, even as I have promised, in the ultramundane lore and empery of Limshakorth." When they had descended from the tower, Yvonne and the 2 Tholuskians debated the interpretation of this answer. Yvonne maintained that their missing companions were present only in the worm's belly. But the others argued that these men had undergone a more mystical translation and were now elevated beyond human sight and hearing. Forthwith they began to make ready with prayer and austerity, looking for some sublime apotheoses which would come to them in due turn. But Yvonne could not trust the worm's equivocal pledges, and fear and doubt remained with him. Seeking for some trace of the lost Polarians to assuage his doubt, he made search of the mighty burg, on whose battlements his own house and the houses of other warlocks were perched, like the tiny huts of fishers on ocean cliffs. In this quest the others would not accompany him, fearing incurring the worm's displeasure. From verge to verge he roamed unhindered, and he climbed perilously on the upper scarps and went down into the deep crevasses and caverns, where the sun failed and there was no other light than the strange luster of that unearthly ice. Embedded here in the walls, as if the stone of the nether strata, he saw dwellings such as man had never built, and vessels that might belong to other ages or worlds. And nowhere could he detect the presence of any living creature, and no spirit or shadow gave response to his evocations. So Yvonne was still fearful of the worm's treachery, and he resolved to remain awake on the night preceding the next celebration of the rites of worship. And eve of that night he assured himself that the other warlocks were all housed in separate mansions, to the number of 5. And then he set himself to watch without remission the entrance of Limshakorth's tower, which was plainly visible from his own windows. Weirdly and coldly stone the great burg in the darkness, pouring forth a light as of frozen stars. The moon rose early on the eastern sea, but Yvonne, holding vigil at his window till midnight, saw that no visible form emerged from the tower, and none entered it. At midnight there came upon him a sudden drowsiness, and he could sustain his vigil no longer, but slept deeply through the remainder of the night. On the following day, there were but 4 sorcerers who gathered in the ice dome and gave homage to Limshakorth, and Yvonne saw that 2 more of the outlanders, men of bulk and stature, dwarfish beyond their fellows, were now missing. One by one, thereafter, on the nights preceding the ceremony of worship, the companions of Yvonne vanished. The last Polarian was next to go, and it came to pass that only Yvonne, Uxlodan and Duni went to the tower, and then Yvonne and Uxlodan went alone. And terror mounted daily in Yvonne, for he would have hurled himself into the sea from Ykith if Uxlodan divined his intention, had not warned him that no man could depart therefrom and live again in solar warmth and terrene air, having been habituated to the coldness and thin ether. So at the time when the moon had waned and darkened wholly, it occurred that Yvonne climbed before Rimshalkorth with infinite trepidation and loath, laggard steps, and entering the dome with downcast eyes, he found himself the sole worshipper. A palsy of fear was upon him as he made obedience, and scarcely he dared to lift his eyes and regard the worm. But soon, as he began to perform the customary genuflections, he became aware that the red tears of Rimshalkorth no longer fell on the purple stalagmites, nor was there any sound such as the worm was wont to make by the perpetual opening and shutting of his mouth. And venturing at last to look upwards, Yvonne beheld the abhorrent, swollen mass of the monster, whose thickness was now such as to overhang the daïs rim, and he saw the mouth and eye-holes were closed in slumber. Thereupon he recalled how the wizards of Thulask had told him that the worm slept for an interval at the darkening of each moon. Now was Yvonne sorely bewildered, for the rites he had learned could be fittingly performed only while the tears of Rimshalkorth fell down and his mouth gaped and closed and gaped again in a measured alternation. And none had instructed him as to what rites were suitable during the slumber of the worm. And being in much doubt, he said softly, "Wakest thou, O Rimshalkorth?" In reply, he seemed to hear a multitude of voices that issued obscurely out of the pale, tombed mass before him. The sound of voices was weirdly muffled, but among them he distinguished the accents of Duni and Uxlodan, and there was a thick muttering of uncouth words which he knew for the speech of the 5 Polarians, and beneath this he caught, or seemed to catch, innumerable undertones that were not the voices of any creatures of earth. And the voices rose and clamored like those prisoners in some profound oubliette. Anon, as he listened in awe and horror, the voice of Duni became articulate above the others, and the manifold clamor and muttering ceased, as if the multitude were hushed to hear its spokesman, and Yvonne heard the tones of Duni saying, "The worms sleep, but we whom the worms have devoured are awake. Direly has he deceived us, for he came to our houses in the night, devouring us bodily one by one as we slept under his enchantment. He has eaten our souls, even our bodies, and verily we are part of Rimshalkorth, but exist only as in a dark and noisome dungeon. While the worm wakes, we have no separate being, but are merged wholly into the being of Rimshalkorth. Hear then, O Yvonne, the truth which we have learned from our oneness with the worm. He has saved us from the white doom and has taken us upon Ykith for this reason, because we alone of all mankind, who are sorcerers of high attainment and mastery, may endure the lethal ice change and become breathers of the airless void, and thus, in the end, made suitable for his provender. Great and terrible is the worm, and the place wherefore he comes and whereto he returns is not to be dreamt of by mortal men. And the worm is omniscient, save that he knows not the waking of them he has devoured, and their awareness during his slumber. But the worm, though ancient beyond the antiquity of worlds, is not immortal, and is vulnerable in one particular. Whosoever learns the times and means of his vulnerability and has the heart for the undertaking may slay him easily, and for that time, for this deed is during the time of sleep. Therefore we abjure thee now by the faith of the old ones to draw the sword thou wearest beneath thy tiny mantle and plunge it into the side of Relim Shakorth, for such is the means of his slaying. Thus only the going forth of the pale death be ended, and only thus shall we, thy fellows, obtain release from our blind thraldom and incarceration, and with us many that the worm has betrayed and eaten in former ages, and upon distant worlds. And only by the doing of this thing shalt thou escape the worm's mouth, nor abide henceforth as a ghost among other ghosts in the evenal blackness of his belly. But know, however, that he who slays Relim Shakorth must necessarily perish in the slaying. Yvonne, in great astonishment, made questions of Dooney, and was answered readily concerning all he asked. Much did he learn of the worm's origins and essence, and the manner in which Shakith had floated down from transpolar gulfs to voyage the seas of earth. Ever as he listened, his abhorrence greatened, though deeds of dark sorcery had long indurated his flesh and soul, making him callous to more than common horrors. But of that which he learned it were ill to speak now. At length there was silence in the dome, for Yvonne had no longer any will to question the ghost of Dooney, and they that were imprisoned with Dooney seemed to wait and watch in a stillness of death. Then, being a man of much resolution and hardihood, Yvonne delayed no longer, but drew from its ivory sheath the short and well-tempered sword of bronze which he carried at his baldric. Approaching close to the dais, he plunged the blade into the over-swollen mass of Relim Shakorth. The blade entered easily, slicing and tearing as if he had stabbed a monstrous bladder, and was not stayed even by the broad pommel, and the whole right hand of Evan was drawn after it into the wound. He perceived no quiver or stirring of the wound, but out of the wound there gushed a sudden torrent of black, liquidaceous matter, swiftening and deepening till the sword was caught from Yvonne's grasp, as if in a mill race, hotter far than blood and smoking with strange steamy vapors. The liquid poured over his hands and splashed his raiments as it fell. Quickly the ice was awash around his feet, but still the fluid welled as if from some inexhaustible spring of foulness, and it spread everywhere in meeting pools and runlets. Yvonne would have fled then, but the sable liquid, mounting and flowing, was about his ankles. When he neared the stairhead, it rushed down the stairway before him like a cataract. Hot and hotter it grew, boiling and bubbling, while the current strengthened and clutched at him and drew him like a malignant's hands. He feared to essay the downward stairs, nor was there any place in the dome where he could climb for refuge. He turned, striving against the tide for bare foothold, and saw through the reeking vapors the throned mast of Relim Shakorth. The gash had widened prodigiously, and a stream surged from it like waters of a broken weir. And yet, for further proof of the worm's unearthly nature, his bulk was in no wise diminished thereby. And still the black fluid came in an evil flood, and it rose swirling about the knees of Yvonne, and the vapors seemed to take the form of a myriad phantoms, wreathing and dividing obscurely as they went past him. Then tottering giddily on the stairheads, he was swept away and was hurled to his death on the icy steps far below. That day, on the sea to the eastward of Middle Hyperborea, the crews of certain merchant galleys beheld an unheard-of thing. As they sped north, returning from far ocean isles, with a wind that aided their oars, they sighted in the late forenoon a monstrous iceberg whose pinnacles and crags loomed high as mountains. The berg shone in part with a weird light, and from its loftiest pinnacle poured an ink-black torrent, and all the ice cliffs and buttresses beneath were astream with rapids and cascades and sheeted falls of the same blackness that fumed like boiling waters as they plunged oceanward, and the sea round the berg was clouded and streaked for a wide interval, as if with the dark fluid of the cuttlefish. The mariners feared to sail closer, but, full of awe and marveling, they stayed their oars and laid watching the berg, and the wind dropped, so that their galley drifted with the view of it all that day. The berg dwindled swiftly, melting as if though some unknown fire consumed it, and the air took on a strange warmth between gusts of arctic coldness, and the water about their ships grew tepid. Crag by crag, the ice was runneled and eaten away, and huge portions fell off with a mighty splash, and the highest pinnacles collapsed, but still the blackness poured out, as from an unfathomable fountain. The watchers thought, at while, that they beheld houses ruining seaward amidst the loosening fragments, but this was of uncertain because of those ever-mounting vapors. By sunset, the berg had diminished to a mass no larger than a common floe, yet still the welling blackness streamed out, and it sank low in the water, and the weird light was quenched altogether. Thereafter, the night, being moonless, was lost to vision. A gale rose, blowing strongly from the south, and at dawn the sea was void of any remnant. Concerning the matters related above, many and various legends have gone forth throughout Mu-Tulan, and all the hyperboreal kingdoms and archipelagos. The truth is not in such tales, for no man hath known the truth heretofore. But I, the sorcerer Yvon, calls up through my necromancy the wave-wandering spirit of Yvon, have learned from him the true history of the worm's advent, and I have written it down in my volume with such omissions as are needful for the sparing of mortal weakness and sanity. The men will read this record, together with much more of the elder lore, in days long after the coming and melting of the great glacier. So quoth this raven. Now, of course, Mr. Smith was a friend and colleague of Lovecraft, as you can see in this lovely little tale. I hope you enjoyed it, my darlings. It was a bit longer than I'd planned, but all the better for it, I suppose. Thank you so much for coming to my little chateau and visiting me. It means so much. It would mean so much more if you would subscribe and like the video. And please come again. I'll always have tea and cookies for you. And special thanks to my Patreon supporters: Ermin, Darren and Jennifer, Laura, Mutant Artificial Intelligence, Tabby Cat, Robert, and of course to Charlotte Emerson and Cortez Williams.